absurd this discourse has gotten.
Can I make a prediction?
Yes. Prediction's great.
I think people misunderstand Elon's incentives for buying Twitter. So, and I haven't talked to him about this, so I'm just making a complete subjective prediction. I think he's going to buy Twitter. I think he's going to clean it up. I think he's probably going to generate something like a 2x on this. We talked about how, that's like a good terminal valuation in 6 or 7 years. That basically, puts that asset worth at around $100 billion. In the meantime, he's going to open source as much as possible. I think he's going to make it very difficult for misinformation and disinformation to get very far. He said he's going to authenticate every human being that uses the platform. He said all of these things publicly already. And then here's the masterstroke. And again, this is just me speculating. I think he's going to donate it into a foundation and a trust. And I think it'll be an incredibly powerful competitive alternative to all these other for-profit businesses, because everything you guys are talking about is the incentives that get perverted when you have to layer economics inside the New York Post, inside the Washington Post, inside the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. Everything eventually devolves to clickbait, to hearsay, to doxing, to whatever can get you more revenue. But if you can take it off the table and run these things as a public trust, you can actually win back a bunch of confidence, and a lot of these edge cases go away. Now, you would say, why would anybody do that? Well, I think the real answer is because then if he were to donate it into a foundation, he'd get $100 billion credit that he could use, to offset the gains when SpaceX or Starlink go public.
Interesting theory. Interesting theory.
There you go.
Well, I agree with everything except for the donation part, because he's raising 20-something billion from private equity partners.
He could pay off
and
the
lenders.
debt and then donate.
He'll pay the debt off. He'll own it 100%. And he'll pay people a very fair living wage, and it'll attract people that want to seek out the truth, that want to work in an apolitical environment. He's already said that 10% of the extremes, are both equally crazy. He's going to force this thing to be rational and predictable.
It's an interesting prediction.
I think it goes public again, and it goes to 5 times the valuation.
Are we going to be able to ask him these questions in Miami?
Sure. Why not?
Okay. Yeah, so let me ask you guys a question. What would you do? Because a lot of people have pointed out in response to what has obviously become a very polarizing set of discussions this week around what should be censored, what should be banned, what shouldn't, et cetera. Elon's going to let bullying and hate speech kind of proliferate. Other people have said we need to release, the restrictions and let people say what they want to say. Freedom of speech has no bounds, et cetera. What do you guys think about the argument that there does need to be constraints and boundaries set around things related to health and safety? Meaning, if someone is making calls to violent action, should that be censored, Sacks? And how do you make that interpretation? Because it becomes a fuzzy gray interpretation. And then separately, like when there are scientific papers that say one thing and someone says that's not true and says something else, how do you kind of decide whether or not that should be allowed or censored on the platform? Because I think those are two very key issues that...
We got to take them separately. Let's do violence first. Sacks, there's plenty of precedent in law.
Yeah.
Just explain the violence.
Look, the biggest straw man around this...
Because this was the whole Trump argument, right? It was like he was inciting violence was the argument that was being made. But like, generally speaking, is that an appropriate form of censorship on this private platform? And if so, how do you set that standard? Let's
start here with, you hear this argument a lot, which is that if Elon brings free speech back to Twitter, then we're going to have all of this horrible content on there. You're going to have violence, you're going to have racism, you're going to have harassment, you're going to have all these bad things on fraud. The truth of the matter is that, and it's really a straw man argument, because what it's basically arguing is that free speech means anything goes. But free speech does not mean anything goes. We have 230 years of Supreme Court case law basically discussing this question of what speech is protected and what's not. And the Supreme Court has ruled that there's 9 major categories of speech that are not protected by the First Amendment. Why? Because that speech is considered to be dangerous in one degree or another. So for example, you can't commit fraud like, the Archegos guy or whatever, and then say, well, that speech was protected by the First Amendment. First Amendment doesn't protect fraud. First Amendment doesn't protect incitement to commit violence or a crime. It doesn't protect fighting words. So you could ban all ethnic or racial slurs on these social networks under the concept of fighting words. So I think if you actually look at Supreme Court case law, well, what I would do is instead of just making up the content moderation policies as I went along, I would look at the cases where people have been wrestling with these decisions for decades, and I would create a content moderation policy inspired by First Amendment case law, where I would take these 9 categories of sort of dangerous speech or harmful speech, and I would operationalize those. So, for example, you can't defame people, right? The First Amendment doesn't protect you against claims of defamation.
Would you make people go to court, though, in order for them to take it down?
Right. So this is where the word operationalize really comes in. It's not practical for a social network to require a court-level burden of proof to prove defamation, right? So what I would do is I would say that if you are a person who claims to be defamed, you could file a report on Twitter and provide the tweet and provide, some explanation. And as long as it looks like a colorable claim of defamation, meaning the person is attacking you in a way that seems out of bounds, then potentially that can be taken down. You don't have to subject it to a jury trial or something like that. So what I would do is you can't literally impose First Amendment case law, but I would use it as the basis for defining a content moderation policy.
Can I just say something? I think one of the best things about being your friend is sometimes you say stuff that is so powerfully smart and elegant because it's so simple. Basically what Sacks said for everybody else, because this is how he's like, the PRD for content moderation has existed. It's called the Constitution. It's just that nobody in any of these companies has taken an effort to actually try to write code that maps to this PRD, where the PRD is the Constitution, right, whose rights have been established for hundreds of years.
By PRD, you mean product requirements document.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, it's what a product manager would use.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Instead of them making this up all as they go along, I would look to the categories of speech the Supreme Court has already ruled out as being dangerous. Exactly.
Write a PRD.
Let's just do the health one, Sacks. So there's a scientific paper that says this drug doesn't cure COVID. And then someone goes on Twitter and says, take this drug, it cures COVID. What's your, and I know you're not obviously a constitutional lawyer at this point in your career, but how would you kind of think about that? And how do you think that would ultimately resolve in this regulatory framework?
That's a debate that should exist. I mean, I don't know why we need to suppress that debate.
So if someone says declaratively on Twitter, this drug will cure COVID, which, by the way,
and
the
it trends.
And just to be clear, by the way,
list,
the FDA actually regulates claims like that on boxes and material in a commercial setting. And if you're making money off Twitter and you're getting a lot of followers, and then you make more money by putting out a tweet that says,
"Yeah, but you're not making money off the drug."
Yeah,
right. Exactly. Look, if the person is selling the drug,
Roche would never say that.
Right. So if someone went on Twitter and they said, "Take this drug, it cures COVID," but there's a sign.
You're confusing facts and authority. Twitter is riddled with people that have zero authority that spit out what they think are facts.
Right.
So I think what you're speaking to is something very different, which is if you're going to design a social network, I've been part of helping to design one, so let me just give you my 2 cents on this topic. There are layers of decision making that need to go into an algorithm to get to a sense of rank. Okay, rank means, do we believe with some reasonable probability distribution, that this thing is worth showing to somebody else? And the way that you get there is through multiple layers. So there's obviously a layer where you can get signal relative to the authenticity of the person and individual making the claim. Is it a bot? Is it a real person? Then there's a separate layer, which is how, roughly accurate do we think this is? Then there's another layer, which is this person believable in making all of those statements? And my point is there are different subsystems you build for those things. He's already said all these algorithms are going to be open sourced. And what you're talking about is authority. You should allow people to say stupid things. It's not illegal.
Right.
Yes, a person can be on a street corner saying Jesus is the Son of God and he will save your soul. Sacks doesn't have to believe him. And somebody can say that on Twitter. The issue here is, does it trend and do you show it to people the algorithm? And if you fix those problems, then who cares if a person says, hey, listen.
Twitter has an authority problem and a ranking problem. And the authority problem comes from the fact that there's all kinds of long-tail, non-human individuals in the system.
So solve for identity and this problem can get easier solved, and solve for trending and it gets solved.
So if you guys were running Twitter, you would not put on these COVID-19 warnings, this is misinformation.
I like labels.
And rely solely on CDC guidance and recommendations and FDA approvals when it comes to treatments and vaccines and risks and so on. You would let anyone say whatever they wanted.
No,
Friedberg, how often was the CDC wrong?
Put a label. Yeah.
By the way, I'm not arguing for the case. I'm just trying to get clarity here. Yeah.
He's just asking the question. What I would do is, and I'm going to use Sacks, is I would label it, and I wouldn't label it right or wrong. I'd say ivermectin is a drug. Here's the Wikipedia page. Hold on.
Yeah.
Here's the Wikipedia page on ivermectin. Let's say there's a lot of confusion about ivermectin, which there was. You could just put, anytime anybody says the word ivermectin, here's a sentence of what ivermectin is. Here's the Wikipedia page, the CDC page, the UK government's page, DHS, whatever, for more information about this topic.
So I just want to
not a warning.
Yeah, I just
wanted to learn more.
Cal, I want to disagree with what you're proposing because it is the topic du jour. It was the one-off that then triggered the ability for everyone to bifurcate on their point of view on what should or shouldn't be done, as opposed to having a universal standard that is universally applied, that doesn't speak specifically to just the COVID-19 pandemic, or just ivermectin, or just what Trump said or didn't say. But each one of these things can and should be universally standardized, and then universally communicated, and then treated with universal standards across everyone and every topic, rather than have each of these breakouts where you've got someone at Twitter scratching their head saying, this seems to be an important topic. Let's come in and annotate it. Let's create a classification for this. And that's where everyone gets riled up, in my opinion. I think if there was a universal standard that was universally applied without judgment
give another example
to the topic.
Give an example.
Go ahead,
Can I address this?
Well, vaccines is another good example, but yeah.
First of all, nobody contradicted the CDC more than the CDC itself. It constantly put out revisions of its old opinions. First, it said that COVID was not spread human to human. Then it obviously said that it was. It basically was against masks, then it was for them, and on and on and on it went, okay? The idea that you cannot criticize your government or an agency of the government is absurd. But that is the type of censorship that was being leveled in these social networks, is that basically they were preventing us from criticizing the so-called experts. That is precisely the kind of censorship that should not exist on these networks. That is precisely the kind of debate.
But what about labeling in the way I talked about it? Like,
the problem with
here's
labeling,
more information.
The problem with labeling is, once again, it's done selectively, and the people at Twitter basically decide who they think is right in a debate, and they basically want to act as a referee to raise the hand of one of the participants of the debate, raise their hand over their head, and declare them the victor. Now, it's a lot better to label than to just censor the other side's point of view, but still, it is a form of self-censorship.
But the labeling I described, which happens on our podcast on Spotify, where it says, here's the COVID Information Center, for more information, and they give a range of. So if it's executed in that way, do you oppose it? If there's like a very confusing public interest going on?
If you were to algorithmically post related stories or something like that, and it was done in a completely fair and speech neutral way, and it was just as a feature of Twitter, fine. But if you have employees at Twitter sitting around discussing issues and deciding who the winner is in various debates, and then putting their thumb on the scale to tilt the debate towards those people, that's not what they should be doing. Now, and that is basically what they're doing with censorship. If you look again, let's go back to this topic of misinformation, because this is really the crux of the debate. Okay. Once again, on the basis of First Amendment case law, you could remove offensive material on Twitter on the basis that it is, fighting words, it's a slur, it's harassment, it's incitement to violence. It's fraud, okay, inauthentic, that the account is not who they purport to be. You remove all the bots. So all that content can get removed. So what is really left then? It is basically this idea of misinformation, this idea that we are going to declare one party the victor in this debate. And I think that is what is so offensive about this Ministry of Truth that Homeland Security is setting up. It's what's so offensive about the censorship that Twitter has been practicing, which is they are trying to end the debate. They're trying to say, look, this is the person on the side of truth. And that is not what they should be doing. It's up to the marketplace to decide what the truth is.
All right. There you have it, folks.
Do you disagree with that?
I agree with you.
To your point, David, I do think in a situation where the public good and there's confusion in a situation, sending people to more information isn't a bad idea. I do think a lot of this, there were thumbs on the scales and it wasn't transparent what was happening. I think if you add transparency, so I think every time there's an action that's taken, it should say agent number and what their agent number is, took this action on this tweet for this reason, and then data scientists can look at all the actions that occur and then say, look, we're looking at this agent number, and here's their manager's agent number, and here's why they took down this post. Then at least you could have a starting point to figure out what's going on. We don't even have enough information to know what thumbs are on what scales, if at all, or to what extent. And I would like to see transparency first so we could have a more informed decision. And then sending people to trusted information sources, a group of them, isn't a bad idea, I think.
What's trusted?
Yeah, I mean, and so to your point, you don't need to look to a podcaster, a social network, or the government to find truth in the world. You have to have a process yourself. That's part of what this podcast is. It's for people to develop.
Part of being an adult.
Yes, you have to come up with your own process of coming to the truth. You could trust. Some people trust the government agencies. Some people trust a Joe Rogan or a podcast or this podcast. Some people trust a folk singer. Trust yourself. That's the number one thing you have to learn how to do as an adult in life. Take in all this information and make a reasonable decision. To take ivermectin or to not take ivermectin is a perfect example. People said there's no downside to it. People have been taking this drug forever and it's cheap. And then another group of people said, well, you're taking horse medicine. It's like, no, that's something completely different. And the whole conversation became, I felt, very easy to parse.
When you think about
do your own research, do your own research.
Right. And
talk to your doctor.
Do your own research, but you can't do your own research if you're not permitted to see everything. And you think about, like, with drugs, think about how many drugs over the last 30, 40 years have become the basis for product liability lawsuits because they had unintended side effects or consequences, and they revised the use of those drugs, or drugs were taken off the market. If people weren't allowed to question those things because supposedly the experts had ruled on the issue and ended the debate, how would we have gotten a correction on that? How would we have gotten to the truth? So just because the experts say something doesn't mean that is true. By the way,
there's pros and cons to this. We have tons of kids taking all kinds of SRIs and antidepressants and all kinds of drugs. Parents have to make difficult decisions. Adults need to make difficult decisions. Do they do this? Do they not? And by the way, we don't know. We're doing large-scale experimentations on the population in real time with drugs. It is a decision you have to do the pros and cons for.
The medical establishment at one point in time thought it was a good idea to lobotomize people. Like, they were doing that as like a medical procedure. So these people can be wrong, and this idea that we've arrived at the end of history and we know the truth.
Here's all truth. Yes.
Exactly.
No new facts are no new knowledge is being created.
For fuck's sake. I mean,
That's a dangerous assumption.
Is red wine good for you or bad for you? Because every 3 or 4 fucking years, coffee and red wine are good for you or bad for you, depending on the year.
Well, I saw a longitudinal study that just came out that said there are no caloric benefits of intermittent fasting. Now, there's a lot of people that would be up in arms with that. What are you supposed to do if maybe there's some value to organ health, maybe there's some value to managing your glycemic index. But again, the point is there are study upon study, there's work going on all the time. All these things are in an area of gray. And so if all of a sudden you jump down one person's throat and basically become very judgy because you think that the total bounded body of knowledge has already been created, you are making an enormous mistake.
I mean, Steve Jobs thought he could cure his own cancer. I mean, intelligent people are free to make bad decisions. He was one of the most intelligent, talented people in the world who, by all accounts, might have survived longer if he had trusted.
He went through this very specific method of juicing. There's a certain sliver of folks. There's a really incredible documentary actually on Netflix, if you want to understand it, of people that went down this path of juicing trying to eliminate their cancer.
Micronutrients.
The irony is that the people who are, I think, some of the stupidest people, like that woman singing show tunes, these are the people who are making these determinations over what is true and what is false and what is labeled as information and what we get to discuss. It's
riddled
crazy.
with bias. It's riddled with bias.
You have to make your own decisions in these cases. And, it's great to have smart friends to have a dialogue with. And Twitter should be dialogue.
It's the beautiful thing about being an American and working so hard to get to this country is the independence and the freedom to be your own self. I mean, why is that such a bad thing? And why would anybody want to give that up to a nameless, faceless blob in an organization?
Well, and the response you get back from people is,
I'm not abdicating my ability to think for myself to this rando woman singing show tunes.
And then people say like, oh, well, the response I got when I said, listen, trust yourself is like, well, what about all these bros who are listening to Joe Rogan and they're making decisions on their health according to Joe Rogan? I'm like, yeah, it's called personal responsibility. I'm not responsible for Joe Rogan's listeners. If Joe Rogan listeners,
the same person that told you that is probably microdosing and thinking ayahuasca is the solution to every problem they've ever had.
Intermittent fasting and micro juicing, and
from the childhood trauma they had when they didn't win their soccer medal and
nobody didn't
get into Harvard, so they're on ayahuasca every day. I mean, give me a break.
Yeah.
Nobody knows. No, we all know so little. So
here's what we know. You live, you die. The end.
And we're all just trying to do our best. And so why don't we all just try to have a reasonably decent time and be nice to each other?
All right, everybody. It's been an amazing episode. We will see you in Miami, which will be absolutely fun and thrilling. Sold out. Our first All-In Summit. And last, because I don't know who the fuck's going to do this work next time.
You will. You're doing an amazing job. You will
thank you,
continue
pal.
it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Love you, boys.
Back at you. We'll let your winners ride.
Rain Man David Sacks.